But it does mean, therefore, thinking about the combination of measures that will add up to the kind of emissions reduction target that one needs, and understanding how they play out over time. And this is a generic graph on the screen here, but one that we use a lot with city government clients, just to sort of start that thinking process, that actually the thing that will, in most cities, makes the biggest difference to improving sustainability is changing the urban form. Generally increased densification, higher public transport, less car usage, etc. But it can be different in different contexts. But changing the urban form in an already well-developed city is a huge task, which probably takes at least 3 or 4 decades. And therefore, one can't expect any great returns from it in the immediate term. That's the sort of green-shaded long box. So when one starts to think about the things that will make big differences quickly, and we need to do that in terms of our requirements around climate change, you have to start turning to things like building retrofit. And on a fairly aggressive standard, it's realistic in most of the cities that I've worked in to think that you could retrofit buildings, i.e. change their internal and external fabric and some of their operating systems so that they're more energy efficient, change the entire building map of the city within a decade. It's sort of technically feasible and financially feasible to do so, and we'll talk about that a bit later in a minute. Changing the transport system is a bit of a longer term thing, generally a 20 or 30 year time frame. Greening the grid, well, that's a longer term thing which needs lots of involvement from government. So starting from this sort of generic plan, thinking about how a city might develop. And I'm just going to go through 5 or 6 themes which I encounter most in talking with cities around the world, as well as some that I think ought to be coming on the agenda and aren't at the moment. A lot of this, inevitably, is quite similar to some of the themes that my former boss, Ken Livingstone, talked about earlier. So I will try not to repeat what he said, but instead to build on it. But I am going to start in the same place, which is that the form that a city takes is the absolutely critical thing to determining whether or not it can be sustainable. Fairly exaggerated and obvious example here, the model of the 20th century, cities built for cars, following the example of Los Angeles and the top of the picture, which we now know, and in my mind at least, doesn't work, can't work in the end. Cities get to a certain size where it's simply not possible to build enough road infrastructure that the city can function in a way that really brings high quality of life without severe problems in terms of congestion, reducing economic performance, air pollution, and indeed CO2 pollution. Newer models of design, and this is a design here from a Chinese eco-city. I think this is Dongtan outside of Shanghai, which is unfortunately delayed in being developed out at the moment. But the general theme of those new developments is very different. Very high density of living, but with extremely large, a lot of attention to greenery within that system. And in this particular example, no vehicles allowed in at all that have any kind of carbon emissions at source. So an assumption of electric and hybrid vehicles. And the critical thing in all of this, really, in this design, there's an importance about density of design in terms of enabling more efficient energy infrastructure, but most importantly, it's to enable a high reliance on public transport and cycling and walking. Now, obviously, in a country like Norway, there are very good reasons why you need major road infrastructure and reliance on cars, given the size of the country and the fact that cities are so spread out. But nevertheless, in the context of the world as a whole, one has to start looking at sustainable cities from the perspective of transport, because the figures are simply so frightening. We're at about 1 billion vehicles in the world today. By most conservative estimates, we'll be at about 2 billion vehicles by 2020. When you look at the projections of the International Energy Authority on increased oil demand over the next 20 years, projections of rising from around 85 million barrels a day to about 105 million barrels. 97% of that increase, 97% of the extra oil that is expected to be demanded will be for transport, a very large proportion of it for road vehicle transport. So if one isn't able to constrain that demand, either through different types of vehicles or modal shift, then it's pretty much unavoidable that we will progress to catastrophic climate change. So how to address that? Well, the example that Ken touched upon this morning and that has been very successful in London and Stockholm and a few other places, is road pricing. Doesn't fit everywhere. I think it's a place to start because carbon pricing, in my mind, is going to be inevitable if we're going to tackle climate change in most countries in the world and starting in most urban centres. And actually, road transport is the ideal place to start with carbon pricing because it's relatively easy to judge who are the big emitters. It's relatively easy to capture the data through camera-type systems or transponder systems and to put in place a charging infrastructure, as has been the case in London. Ken talked about the figures on this, but London's big number one political issue in the year that he was being elected mayor for the first time in 2000 was traffic congestion. Never been seen before in a British political election. Higher than crime, higher than education, higher than health. Traffic congestion was the issue that people were most concerned about because it was simply stopping the economic functioning of the city. The congestion charge, which many people opposed very bitterly, but which is now largely accepted, and I'll show some of the figures in a moment, had the impact of reducing the number of vehicles in central London by about 70,000 per day in its first week of operation, and that's stayed pretty much the same ever since. And whilst congestion is still certainly an issue in London, it's no longer an issue that really threatens the development of the city. It was extremely difficult to bring in, however, and Ken, I think, was rather modest this morning when he was talking about this. Most people thought it was the end of his political career when he announced that he was going to bring in a congestion charge. And indeed, I don't think I've met a politician who would have brought in the charge in the face of the strength of the opposition that he experienced. And this graph here shows you how the opinion polls were changing in the lead up to the congestion charge. So at the point at which it came in February 2003, actually this is slightly wrong. There was a slight majority against the charge, which had changed from a slight majority in favour of it in the preceding year. But people assumed that once it came in, that majority against would go up massively as people experienced the charge. As you can see, the opposite happened. The charge came in and people found that actually only 70,000 vehicles a day affected 11 million people in London on an average working day. The vast majority of people didn't drive into central London during the charging hours, but a huge number of them did use the buses that went in to central London during that time, or walked or cycled, and saw an immediate benefit in terms of improvement in the reliability and speed of their journeys into work, whilst only a small minority had to pay. And in the majority, the people who were paying were among the wealthiest in the city, with the charges largely paid by business. So support for the charge has stayed at around 55-60% since it was brought in, with a vociferous minority against, until, as you can see, as the sort of wavy green line and the red line come back together again in 2005, until Ken announced that he was going to double the size of the zone of the charge. And again, the opposition came up. Again, everybody said it was going to be the end of the world. Huge media campaign, which had the effect of persuading people who weren't going to be affected that it would cost them. Again, Ken didn't back down in the face of that, brought the charge in. Again, people saw it in operation, and the same levels of popularity returned. So I think the lesson from that is you can do something that is apparently very politically difficult, like bringing in a congestion charge, but you've got to stick to your guns. You mustn't, having decided to do it, mustn't back down in the face of the media opposition, and have confidence that it will work. And in particular, trying to avoid the situations that have happened in the places that have tried and failed to introduce, like Manchester and New York, where you have to go to a vote of the public before bringing the charge in, because all the evidence is before people know what the charge is going to be like, they'll vote against it. Once they see it in operation, they'll vote for it. Of course, the congestion charge wouldn't have worked in London if there hadn't been available alternatives. If you'd simply been putting a punitive charge on drivers and they were still going to have to drive, it would have been immensely unpopular. The reason it wasn't, as Ken said, so I won't dwell on this, huge investment in the public transport infrastructure across London, massive expansion of every single bus route across the whole of London, a 40% increase in passengers, huge improvement in the reliability of the buses because they weren't getting congested in the centre of the city, as well as an increased number, and a lot of investment in the tube system also. which made that one of the biggest success stories in terms of a shift from cars to public transport, a 5% shift, as Ken mentioned earlier. Very expensive in London. I normally show this slide when I'm in a developing world city, but just to mention it, it doesn't have to be expensive. The bus rapid transit system's been brought in Bogota and Curitiba in Brazil, which have been similarly successful, were done on a shoestring. And actually, the mayor of Curitiba, the former mayor, Jaime Lerner, is very proud of saying now that the effect of his public transport improvements in Curitiba, which had been one of the most congested cities in the world, means that when polling companies do a survey of his city and ask people how many people would like to live somewhere else other than Curitiba, only 2% say that they'd like to live anywhere else. When they do a survey of their nearest big neighbour and major rival, Sao Paulo, and ask the same question, 70% of Sao Paulistas say not only they'd like to live somewhere else, but they'd like to live in Curitiba. So this is regarded by the Curitiba Tourist Board as one of their big selling points. I couldn't have put this slide up while Ken was still here, but he's now safely on a plane back to London. This is the one success story of his successor, Boris Johnson, albeit a scheme that he stole from Ken. And this is to try and bring a major cycle hire scheme to the centre of London. Copied, in fact, from Paris and Lyon and Barcelona and Copenhagen and others who've done this before. But I think it's really interesting, in going around all the sort of conferences of the big cities around the world, cycling used to be, the sort of poor relative of bus and tube and metro systems. But increasingly now, it's at the top of the agenda for many mayors around the world. Most strikingly in China, I remember very vividly speaking with the Beijing transport advisor as my counterpart back in 2004 or 5, and him proudly showing me a graph that levels of cycling as a proportion of the total modal split in Beijing had reduced from 75% a decade earlier down to just 25%. And they now plan to get it down to about 5% as people move to cars. And I met the same guy about a year ago, did a very similar presentation and very proudly showed us how they had 25% cycling in Beijing and they plan to get this back up to 30% over the next 5 years. And it's really symptomatic of a big shift, I think, that politicians and administrations all around the world, realising in the context of climate change in particular, one of the cheapest and most effective ways to get people to move around a city is by bike. And it's relatively easy if you're willing to create the infrastructure for people to do that in safety, as you can see in places like Copenhagen, relatively nearby. And that solves or helps lots of other social issues within the city, particularly in terms of health and noise and air pollution. So I think these big schemes in London, there are now 10,000 bikes for hire in the centre of London for virtually nothing, a few pence for half an hour, which are being massively used, in fact, overused to the extent that the scheme is currently only available to people who subscribe annually because the mayor hasn't been able to get bikes out onto the street with the rapidity that the demand requires. The mayor of Mexico's just launched a very similar scheme on a bigger scale, and when I was last with them, the mayors of Buenos Aires and Rio were looking at very similar schemes.